Just like that, Formula One preseason testing is done and dusted, and there is some very interesting storylines to come out of testing. I know we can only take so much out of testing, but we can certainly start to get an idea of what the season is going to look like. So let's get into a quick recap of Formula One preseason testing, and let's take a look at what the potential pecking order might be to start the season. Hello everybody, my name is Michael, and welcome back to Last to First. I don't think I've ever been more excited for preseason testing in my life before. Now that I am making content about Formula One and just on top of my overall excitement and love of Formula One, I was just so excited to get the season underway and start digging into everything. And it's been deeply curious and deeply fascinating so far, and I am just so ready for the first race in Melbourne. But before we get to that first race, we do need to take a look at the preseason testing, and let's take a look at a little quick recap of it. Day one is always a really tricky day in testing. I mean, overall testing is of course super tricky because we can only take so much from it, and we don't know all of the fine details about run plans, fuel loads, that type of stuff. But day one is particularly tricky just because the teams are really trying to get their foot in the door and get back into the swing of things. They're doing some of their more basic tests and just trying to get a feel for the car and everything. But we still started to see some trends in day one that followed throughout the rest of testing. One team that continued to look not so bad starting out in day one or not so good, I should say, was Sauber. They struggled with traction and consistency, and they were really looking to be the worst car after day one. Williams was maybe the biggest surprise of testing in general, really, but particularly on day one. They showed a lot of good speed and were looking pretty good after day one, but the drivers were needing to correct the car a lot, so they were still finding that sweet spot for the car, but they were a big surprise of day one. Also, after day one, we kind of saw Alpine and Williams potentially emerging as the midfield standouts, but so far in day one, no team seemed to really be able to break into the top four, that of course being Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes. McLaren was quite quiet on day one, but they did look very composed and they did look quite quick. Mercedes also looked surprisingly decent. They had a stable platform and looked like they had a good balance throughout the day. Could that be down to the cooler conditions on day one? Definitely a good possibility. And also Ferrari, they had some really strong peaks after day one, but they did seem to have some type of inconsistent handling. Red Bull had a challenging day one and really a challenging test overall, but the car seems to be pretty solid, but it was a bit tricky at times, and it caught out Lawson when he spun on day one. After day one, Aston Martin seemed to have a more stable car, and that's kind of what they were going for. After last year, they want a better platform to build on, a more benign car, and they did seem to potentially build on that, but it was a pretty quiet day one for them. And we had Racing Bulls, who did a lot of mileage, but they looked kind of off the pace. Surprisingly, with the full day one, there was really great reliability, which I guess you might not be too surprised given we are in the fourth year of these regulations, as well as the engine formula hasn't changed in quite some time, but there really weren't many hiccups at all. Now, moving on to day two, we started to see a bit more of the potential pecking order and start to get a better idea of things. And McLaren were really the standouts of the session. They seemed to be the pace setters after a really impressive long run performance, and they do seem to be at the top of the field. Also, we had Williams topping the timesheets. Just, they're not likely to be the fastest team overall or fighting for that top four, but it was interesting to see them at the sharp end of the grid. But they just continue to impress in day two, and they look to be on a positive trajectory at this point. Mercedes had another positive day two where they looked to be consistent and looked to have a pretty solid car underneath them. Just once again, it was a cooler day, cooler conditions out, which they typically do better in. So is that performance down to the conditions, or has Mercedes finally started to understand these regulations? Ferrari continued to show some of those strong peaks, but also showed some inconsistencies and some trouble with instability. But Hamilton does seem to be fitting into that car nicely, and it does seem to be suiting him quite well. Day 2 really cemented Sauber's place as the weakest team of the 10. They just seemed to be a bit off of things. Haas continued to stick to their high fuel and long run plans, so we really don't know where they're at after day 2 as well. Really, overall, the whole field or the whole picture of day 2 seems to be the top 4 teams have kind of remained unchanged, and reliability continued to be excellent, apart from some surprising rain that happened in day 2. Now, day 3 continued to get more interesting, and it cemented more of the findings that we've kind of come across over the past couple days. McLaren continued to lead in the long run pace, with Ferrari closer to Mercedes than McLaren. It seems that Ferrari and Mercedes are going to be very tightly matched, with McLaren maybe just ahead. Verstappen's spin that he had, which is unlike him, hints at Red Bull being a quite tricky car to drive. It seems like it might be a quick car, but once again, it seems like it might have a pretty small window and it might be pretty tricky to drive. Red Bull didn't even have the chance to do a proper race simulation, so they're not looking fully prepared for the first race. Alpine and Williams looked like the best midfield teams after day 3, possibly edging towards the top 4, maybe, we'll see. Racing Bulls continued with a ton of mileage, but it did look a bit unbalanced and didn't look particularly quick. Also, Haas, they once again weren't particularly focusing on the top speed or the qualifying pace of things. They were still focused on long run pace and heavier fuel loads, so they didn't look particularly quick, and not sure exactly where they're going to fit into things. Aston Martin, they continued to struggle again on day 3. They had issues with grip in their car, and they also had Lance Stroll being sick, which definitely doesn't help any. Sauber actually improved a good bit on day 3. They improved the balance pretty significantly, and they did look to be a bit better on day 3 than the rest of the test, but they're still not looking to be the fastest car out there. Now, I could get into some of the fastest laps of the whole testing session, but it's not really worth it to me, in my opinion. You know, we can only take so much from those fastest laps because we don't know all of the details. But just a quick note, it was cool to see Carlos Sainz topping it with Williams. They definitely seem to be on a positive trajectory. They had the fastest lap of the 3 days of testing, and then we had Hamilton and Leclerc with Ferrari coming up just behind him as well. So it looks to be very close. More interestingly, though, was the testing mileage, the overall mileage of each team. And it's just crazy how reliable these cars are now, and how many laps and how much time that they can put on these cars, even for the first weekend of these cars' life for the season. It's pretty insane. But there's some really interesting outliers on this. So we have Mercedes at the top of things with 458 laps, which is quite a lot. On the contrary, we had Red Bull, who actually had the least out of any team, which was quite surprising. They only had 304. So they're looking to be in a bit of a tough spot right now, and they seem to have some of the issues lingering from last year. They had some issues with, I believe it was water pressure that caused some disruptions in the running. So that's definitely looking a little scary times for Red Bull. I wouldn't be completely ringing the alarm bells, but it's not the ideal test for them. Another note is McLaren. Now, they are on the lower end of mileage for, amongst the teams at 381, but they just seem so assured and confident with their car. They seem to have a good grasp and understanding of it, and, they got what they needed out of the test by the looks of it. They seem to know the car seemed to do exactly what they wanted right out the gate, and they didn't need to put any extra time on it than they did. They didn't have any particular problems that hindered them, and they just seemed to be looking like the team to beat this year. If you made it this far into the video and you are interested, please give the video a like and a subscribe, and comment down below who you think is looking best after testing. So let's take a look at what might be the pecking order after preseason testing. And first, I think we have to continue having McLaren as the number 1, as the favorites going into the season. They seem to be the most well-rounded and seem to have the best car, but it does look incredibly close between them and Ferrari and Mercedes. The car just seems to be very quick on demand, and they just seem to be picking up where they left off. Next up, I'm having Ferrari in number 2, but that could easily be there or thereabouts with Mercedes. Ferrari is still kind of figuring out the right balance for the car. They seem to have the higher peaks compared to Mercedes, and that's why I do have them above Mercedes, but they're maybe a bit less consistent than Mercedes. So, it's going to be interesting to see how close they are. With third, I do have Mercedes, and for the first time in this rule set, it seems that the Mercedes car has been pretty consistent and potentially quick. And yeah, it seems like they may have built a pretty decent car. Every time them and the Ferrari went out on track with long run pace, they seem to be extremely, extremely close with McLaren just ahead. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Just the caveat with Mercedes is that it was generally cooler conditions, and they have done better in the cooler conditions. So we'll see how that plays out going into Australia. Now I've got Red Bull at fourth, and I think they're still going to be comfortably within that 4-team fight at the top of the grid, and I think it still is going to be close with Red Bull and all the other teams amongst that top 4, but they do seem to be a bit on the back foot. They were doing tests right up until the end of day 3 with things like FlowViz, which is not typically common to do at the very end of the test. I think it shows that Red Bull might be a bit on the back foot, and they're really still trying to figure out some stuff with their car. At fifth, I have Williams, and like Ferrari and Mercedes, I think they could be interchanged with Alpine. Williams and Alpine just seem neck and neck. Once again, Williams seems to have potentially the higher ceiling compared to Alpine, which is why, like with Ferrari, I have them ahead. One way or another, though, it looks to be a very positive step for them after last year. And it just looks to be exciting times for Williams. I'm excited to see what they can do this year. But despite the headline times, it's not likely that they're going to be fighting in the top 4. But who knows? Maybe if some of those top 4 teams have some issues, like the Red Bull, or if Mercedes just isn't quite on top of these rules again, then they might be chomping at the bits there for some higher places. Alpine is in 6th, similar to kind of Williams. They are in a much better place than last year compared to where they were in preseason testing. They seem to be picking up where they finished in 2024. The car is on weight and looks to be a decent car. Seems to be a bit more even keel and maybe balanced than Williams, but maybe doesn't have quite the high peaks that the Williams does. And it might potentially be faster than Williams, but it's definitely going to be close, and we'll see it soon enough. But once again, even if Alpine is faster than Williams, it's not likely that they're going to be fighting in the top 4. In 7th, I have Racing Bulls, and they did quite a lot of mileage, but they're just generally not looking the quickest. The car seems quite stable, but they do have a lot to learn, and everything is just going to be so close this year that even being in 7th, you might still, even being the 7th fastest car, you might still be so close to 5th, 6th that you might be able to pick up some points here and there. So we'll see. It's going to be super close, but as of right now, I've got Racing Bulls at 7th. Next up, I have Haas in 8th, and Haas is still quite unknown. They really focused on heavy fuel runs and long runs and didn't really show their ultimate speed. They very well could be ahead of Racing Bulls and maybe even fighting with Williams and Alpine, but the signs still point to them being a bit behind a couple of those other teams. But, we were quite pleasantly surprised by Haas last year when they started doing as well as they did, so that could very well be a possibility again this year. In 9th, I have Aston Martin, and they look to be in somewhat of trouble. It's not completely disastrous, but they haven't seemed to make the step that they really need to this year ahead of their much anticipated 2026 year when they become a proper works team with Honda. The car does look more benign, which is what they were looking for, but it also doesn't look particularly quick, and it just doesn't look to be the most exciting car on the grid. Now in 10th, I have Sauber, and might be able to be the most confident in that position next to McLaren. They just seem to be comfortably the slowest car. Once again, like with Aston, it wasn't a completely disastrous test like what maybe Williams had in 2019, but it just doesn't seem to be clicking right. The final day of testing did show some promise where they were able to find a better balance, but it just looks like it's going to be a very challenging year for Sauber. So that is a bit about preseason testing this year for Formula One. While we can't take so much from testing, there are certainly little nuggets that we can take and things that we can learn, and we're starting to put together the pieces of what the pecking order and what the grid is going to look like this year. However, going to Australia next after Bahrain, it is such a different track that everything could be vastly different from what we've seen in testing so far. It likely will be regardless, but it's still going to be a very, very different track to be at. So everything could be quite different, and I'm happy to see what happens with all that. So thank you all for tuning into this. I hope you all are as excited for the new season as I am. I am so ready to get this first race underway in Australia and just ready to get the season underway. I think we're going to be in for a really intriguing year. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next one.